Look, it's wonderful to be here on the other side of the country for me, and I've only got a very, very short trip. But soils, of course, are our most valuable asset. And so it's really important that we can actually be talking about it and talking about soil health. So what I'm going to do today is actually, whoops, gone too quick. I'm going to give you an idea of the global lens, what I'm seeing around the world. I'm also going to give you an idea of what I feel we're moving towards in terms of soil health, natural capital, nature positive. I'm going to give you a bit of a domestic lens, particularly around where we're going with ESG that you would have well heard about. Quick snapshot on WA and then what I'm doing at the local level. Questions are always the best part of this, so we want to make sure we've got time for questions. But probably I'll just start off with a bit about my role. A Special Representative for Australian Agriculture, it's sort of a fancy name. I'm almost like an ag ambassador. It's a very privileged role. I'm the first person who's been in the role, and I've been in it for 3.5 years now. And essentially my role is to be able to advocate for Australian agriculture. It started off as being primarily overseas, but more and more I do a lot domestically, and it's really important for me to engage, particularly with farmers and agribusinesses on the ground here, for two main reasons. One, to be able to hear the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing in farming. The other is to be able to share what I'm hearing overseas. And part of the reason for that is I'm the bridge, I'm the conduit between industry and government. And it is a unique role, and it's a very influential role, because when I'm overseas, or even when I'm speaking with high-level officials, quite often it's government to government. And quite often I will be the only farmer in the room. And as a quick example of that, when I first started in the role, my first trip was to the UK, and we were just negotiating the UK Free Trade Agreement. And I was there fronting the House of Commons committee that was investigating this free trade agreement. And they were dancing around the issue of animal welfare. And I was talking to them about all the great things we do around animal welfare. And eventually one of them said, "How much lamb are we going to get for mulesed sheep?" And I said, "Well, probably very little, because we don't mule our meat sheep. It's our wool sheep, and it's really only our merinos." So I then spent the next 10 minutes actually explaining to them the difference between meat sheep and wool sheep, the fact that we have very hot weather here, we have flies, and from an animal welfare perspective, it is far better to take a small piece of skin off the breech of an animal than to see it die a slow and painful death from fly strike. That made a fundamental difference to that committee. No one had ever told them that. And not surprising, because government officials wouldn't know things like that. So I think that's the thing that we can bring to this role, but why it's so important that I can actually share what I'm hearing, but also hear from you in terms of being able to feed those examples back. Okay, let's start with the global environment. I don't need to tell you how challenging it is at the moment, and it has been for a while. We've had conflict that just continues. We had COVID, cost of living just keeps going up, and of course we've got climate change that's sitting there. Very much our global rules of trading have been driven by Europe, by the EU, and with a very ideological approach, which means that they are very prescriptive. It's basically their way or the highway, which has been very challenging for us, because there's been this no acceptance that there's no one size fits all. And so a lot of my role has been pushing back against that and working with what we call our like-minded friends around the world, Canada, New Zealand, the Latins, to be able to say, how do we push back to get them to understand we need to take a principles-based approach. But then, of course, what have we got? We see what's happening with the US, and I think one of the greatest challenges we're seeing now is that threat to global trade, and probably more so than we're seeing coming from tariffs. And that is the US, if it goes into recession, will impact the whole world. The slowing growth in China is going to impact our exports. So all of this, of course, is bringing a huge amount of uncertainty. And if there's one thing business really doesn't like, and that's uncertainty. You can't invest, you can't think about how you may plan for the future. So this has been a huge challenge to us. But what's happening globally? So globally, we have something called the Sustainable Development Goals. So these SDGs are something that have been put into place around what are our global aspirations. And things such as zero hunger are what underpin global food security. So there's a lot of countries in the world, particularly in developing countries, that actually are really challenged, not just in access to food, but importantly, access to nutrition. And so that is really what's driving a lot of global trading food policies. But even in Australia, I think it's almost like 30% of people here now can be challenged around food security. And that is primarily because of cost of living, but it's something that we just need to be mindful of. So globally, there's still a very strong drive for this. We have legislation now called climate-related financial disclosures. Now, this is driven by the accounting and finance sector, but it means all of our corporates are now needing to report what they're doing around climate. It is being slowly introduced over time. Our largest corporates are now having to report this, and then you'll have the next level of corporates that will report. 30 of our trading partners actually have this legislation. So this is not something that is going to go away. This is in place. And what this is driving is the pressure on farmers to actually be able to think about what is the data you collect. Because if you're part of that agribusiness supply chain, those corporates are going to be asking for this information from you. Because in the future, they're going to need to report what we call their Scope 3, all right, which is their indirect emissions that come along the supply chain. So that's another key driver we see coming globally around climate, soil, things like that. We've also then got something called the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Now, nature-related financial disclosures start to go into things like soil, water, air, biodiversity. That work's being done at the moment, and we actually have that work being picked up now in Australia and also in WA. Of course, the corporates have been dealing with things like ESG, environmental, social and governance, which they need to report on, and it just drives the way that business operates. ESG principles will continue to be there, and they're not getting any less. We had the Global Nature Positive Summit. The first one was held in Sydney last year. A lot of people around the world came and were really excited about what we're doing in Australia. We actually are really world leading in a whole number of areas. So that's another key driver that we're seeing. And then, of course, the climate conference, the major COP, was held in Azerbaijan, in Baku and Azerbaijan last year. Countries from all around the world absolutely embracing what they're doing around climate and completely pushing this. Now, Australia's actually made a bid for COP31 for next year. You're probably well aware, although given you've just had your election, but we will have a federal election in May. So things have gone a bit quiet in terms of our bid for that Australian COP. But if we do get it, and we haven't got a lot of time, we've got to be scrambling then because we've got less than 18 months to get ourselves ready. But, I'm trying to sow the seed about we need to be thinking about the great things we're doing here in Australia that we can really showcase at COP31. What are we doing on soils? Well, Australia is actually world leading on soils. We have a national soil strategy. We have some of the oldest soils in the world, and it's almost like we've taken it for granted what we've been doing around building soil health on farm. So we know that if we don't look after our country, it's not going to be there for the next generation. And we're not subsidised farmers here in Australia compared to many other countries in the world. So we've actually invested in soil health, and the knowledge is growing all the time. In fact, this soil strategy is thought of so highly. Canada has developed a soil strategy themselves called Critical Ground, which they actually released last year. When I was in Canada, they were very proudly telling me about what they're doing around soil health, but strongly built on what we've done here. So we've got great foundations there. There also is a global soil partnership. So we've got a lot of countries around the world that are really focused on soil. And I think if we do get COP31, soil health and oceans will probably be two key priorities for that COP. I'm actually heading off to South America this weekend, which is why I unfortunately can't stay around today and be able to engage with you. The first country I'll be going to is Brazil. Brazil are actually doing some really great work around soil. They also have very, very old soils. There is a Climate and Clean Air conference there that I'll be speaking at, but I'll also be meeting with a lot of the researchers and just the agricultural sector representatives that are doing work around soil. They have what they call an ABC plan that is really around soil and the focus they have and the importance they see for agriculture in that country. I'll then be going on to Uruguay, Chile and Argentina to actually have discussions with others in South America. The EU, of course, has something called the Farm to Fork. That is now being replaced with their new vision for food and agriculture strategy. I don't see too much changing, to be honest. I can be fairly critical of the EU. Their subsidies, for me, are like greenwashing. They say that they've changed them to be more environmentally focused. In actual fact, they're just paying farmers to gather the data. We don't have that luxury here. I think we've really got to look at what are better outcomes, so that they are genuinely making a difference. Sometimes in Europe, I think they're parks and gardeners rather than actual farmers. The UK is an interesting example, though. When I was in the UK towards probably the second half of last year, they, of course, from post-Brexit, are transitioning away from subsidies. So their government is really making a big effort to, as they pull away from giving the subsidies to farmers, making them more environmentally focused and climate focused. So they seem to have a better, a more genuine approach to the outcomes. They're also, more inclined to say, is this working in practice? The reality is, though, of course, farmers aren't happy over there because they've had this big bucket of money and it's being taken away from them. And also something that is really interesting when I go around the world is that in Australia, we actually have quite a good relationship between business and government, even though some of the time we don't think that's the case. There is the ability to have consultation processes, to put in submissions, to engage at either the local or state or even the federal level. A lot of other countries, there's a complete divide between the private sector and government. And so there is a real challenge when government brings in regulations and then you have business and particularly the agricultural sector say this just doesn't work. And we've seen this in the EU where we've seen all that agitation and tractor rallies where they've said the Farm to Fork just doesn't work for us. In Australia, we have a whole number of initiatives going on around climate and the environment. We have our net zero by 2050 targets under which 6 sectoral plans sit, and one of those sectoral plans is the agriculture and land sectoral plan. There's a lot of work being done there to actually say, how do we help farmers prepare for what will be coming around trying to meet these targets? I mean, I have to say that, and there's a lot of focus on the energy sector, that's where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. But I'm sort of saying, look, we need to actually be engaging with the agricultural sector. We can't wait 3 to 5 years till we've sorted out energy and then we then go back to farmers and say, now we need you to come up with some data because we're going to need to start reporting. We need to actually think about that, but I also think we need to think about net zero. It's not going to be net zero for every sector, and it can't be. Some sectors will find it easier than others. It's not going to be net zero for every part of the country. I'm a cattle producer. I'm going to find it easier to do it where I am in southeastern New South Wales than the north and northern cattle sector is going to be able to do. And I also think we need to think about, what does net zero mean? You're going to be able to get to maybe 80% of the way reasonably well, but that last mile is always going to be really hard, and we shouldn't punish ourselves if we can't get there. And the other thing, it was interesting, I spoke at a grains event yesterday, and one of the challenges we have in Australia, and this clearly was coming from the grain sector, was Australian farmers have been undertaking sustainable practices for so long and not necessarily measuring it. So if you start a baseline now, your improvement isn't this, like some countries are going to have. Your improvement's this because you already were ahead of the 8 ball. How do we demonstrate that to other countries to show that we have the ability to actually be very sustainable? We've then got some other work being done around natural capital, and this natural capital is about putting nature on to the balance sheet, which means you're going to be able to put a value to it It means it's going to increase the value of your farm for whether you want to sell it or whether you want to actually pass it on to the next generation. And there is work being done. It was globally and it's now being established in Australia. There will be something called Value Australia that is established here. Larissa Taylor, who I think a number of you may know, will be leading the work here in WA, and the Value Australia organisation itself will be headed up by someone called Rain Vandenberg, who actually is a Tasmanian who did the work for Forico. Forico is the old gums that had a real reputation issue around what was previously managed investment schemes, and she actually did the work around putting natural capital onto the balance sheet for Forico. Now, that is not recognised under accounting standards at the moment, but I did talk about the nature-related financial disclosures that are coming. We will start to see work being done there. Once again, if we get COP31, I think it would be brilliant if we can showcase what we're doing around this at something like that, because once again, we're world leading here in Australia. The other things that we're doing in Australia at the moment are we have an Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. I love this framework because whenever I go overseas, I put that framework up. It's on the left-hand side. No other country has an overarching articulation of what we're doing around sustainability for agriculture. There are 17 principles there. They go across all of the ESG principles. They talk to the SDGs that I mentioned before that operate globally. They go across animal health, they go across soil, they go across water, biodiversity. But importantly, what sits underneath that are individual sustainability frameworks, individual tools and mechanisms that actually are at the farmer level. So as a beef cattle farmer, I go to the beef sustainability framework, which actually has on the MLA website tools and different ways that I can measure my carbon. I can measure when it comes to things around soil and water, and it's then supported by extension as part of that. So it's actually important to think about what's fit for purpose. The sustainability framework probably means nothing to farmers, but it's great for me to talk about in other countries. It's the individual sustainability frameworks or tools that you actually have on the ground, and they are growing every day in terms of being able to give you assistance. The other piece of work that was really interesting, and I mentioned that Australian farmers aren't subsidised, and so it means that some of the data that we see coming out around the world in comparisons tends to show us as not being that great. So what ABARES, that's the National Agricultural Research Organisation, did was they actually had a look at that data that was coming out of our multilateral organisations, and they adjusted those indicators, and they adjusted them for the diversity of environment. Of course, Australia is a country that's a continent, goes across 5 different climatic zones. I don't need to tell you that your soils are very different. We heard from Josh that just the difference between the soils, sandy soils in Perth to what they are down in Margaret River, adjusted for the diversity of environment, and importantly adjusted for subsidies. What that actually showed was we have really strong sustainability credentials, and that's going to serve us well in terms of our global trade and market access. So things that you know that we've been doing for decades, no and low till, stubble retention, soil, all about soil conservation, nature conservation, building shelter belts. We actually use less nitrogen fertiliser, although once again, when I said this at the Grains event yesterday, they said, well, actually in the West we do use a lot more nitrogen than you might use in the East, but still probably less than what you see in some countries, particularly countries like New Zealand, Ireland, where they get very, very heavy rainfall, a lot of leaching, and of course they're dairy focused. We use much less pesticides. We're not subsidised. We don't have chemical companies providing, containers of chemicals that we need to use all the time. So this was actually a really good example of demonstrating our credentials. I don't need to tell you that you're challenged here in WA. Your soils are pretty poor here, and unfortunately all the indications show that things are only going to get worse here. You are a hotspot for climate change. You're a hotspot for biodiversity, for water stress, and you, of course, know about salinity. So what this means is that there will need to be an ongoing pressure to continue to look at how you can actually farm sustainably and what you may need to do in terms of changing practices. There are things, of course, that you're doing here in WA. You've got the WA restoration economy. GRDC said I must mention the SWAM program because, of course, that's a partnership around soil, water and nutrition. There are things that are very specifically being done here, but, of course, it's never enough, is it? So I just want to end really on just an example of what does this mean for the farmer, because I know that there's many of you here that are saying, that's all very well what's happening in the world. I think my message from what I've said so far is, despite all of that unrest and uncertainty and what we're seeing, the train has left the station in terms of climate and the environment. And we know that if we don't actually look after our soil, think about our water use, think about efficiency, then we're not going to continue to be farming. And so we need to be really focused on that. Some of the things that I've been doing on farm have been really thinking about this. So when I moved to the farm 33 years ago, it was super every year, lime every 5 years. I actually started soil sampling 8 years ago, I think. The primary driver for that actually was the New South Wales government was providing subsidised soil testing. So through my local land services, the old PP boards, they were offering this. So of course I went and got my soil sampler and did my tracks through the paddocks. What that taught me, because it was in conjunction with workshops that were being run, was a better understanding of where I was sitting in terms of my soil fertility, but also, and very importantly, what are the sort of decisions I need to make. Now, I'm an accountant, so what appealed to me was the fact that it told me that at the time, I didn't need to fertilise. I actually haven't fertilised for the last 8 years because each year I do this soil sampling and each year it tells me what my P is. I am actually low on sulphur, but we're only taking a 10 centimetre core, whereas the 40 centimetre cores that are being done by LLS around the district are probably showing that sulphur at 30 centimetres is probably not too bad. So I haven't fertilised. Along with that, I've also learnt about my grazing rotation. I've got a lot more laneways now. I move my stock around. My heifers get the worst paddocks because I don't want them to get fat, but the cows and calves get the best. If I choose to keep steers, which normally I don't, they will also go into a better paddock, and I'm predominantly native. So I've learned all this just from something as simple as being soil sampling. And I think that is where a small incentive can actually make a big difference, because the power in terms of decision making becomes yours when you actually have this information. That was last week's workshop. I had a bit of a gap because I was travelling because of this role, so I didn't soil sample in that 18-19 year. But you can see how my phosphorus has been coming down, and it's now sitting, that dot, at a level now that is actually below the buffer zone. I need to do something about it. My sulphur was low, came up a bit, so I made the decision. I've ordered single super with MO. Once again, just that soil sampling has actually enabled me to make the right decision. When I soil sample next year, I've got to decide what I need to do. If I need to top up with sulphur, I might go gypsum. So what does that mean for us? Globally, when it comes to climate, the finance sector and investment will be a key driver. And as I said, the train's left the station. So, it doesn't matter whether you believe in climate, whether you call it organic is the better way or regen or whatever, they're all on the trajectory to improving what we're doing around our soil, our water and our environment. But we've always got to remember that it's got to be practical. And so what do farmers think about? They think about profitability. It's got to be the money, and that's going to come from increased productivity, and the environment's going to be a bonus. So I keep saying to government, don't just say to farmers and other businesses that you're doing this for the public benefit. If you're going to do it for the public benefit, you need to pay for it. So I think we really do need to keep making sure that we focus on profitability and productivity. It will be important to have that data because that enables us to make the better decisions. The really critical thing for me though, and this is really important for you in the room, and it came through to me from doing the soils workshops that I've been doing over the last number of years, the roles that NRM groups play in terms of extension and adoption, we've got to have that link, because if you don't have it, all of that huge amount of investment in the research and the science sits on the shelf. And for most farmers, they learn from other farmers. So, I learn from going for the workshop, but then when we're having a cup of tea, I'm talking to other people in the district about what they're doing, and we're sharing different things. And, when I actually rang up to get the super, I knew what the price was, because when I was at the workshop last week, I'd spoken to others and I got it cheaper than anyone else did, but then I was probably getting more tonnage. But that's also really important. Collaboration is essential, but it's also got to be fit for purpose, and there is no one size fits all. But in the end, and I say this around the world, healthy soils are our most valuable asset. And if we have healthy soils, we'll have healthy plants and animals, we'll have healthy people and a healthy environment. So thank you. I'll leave it there and we might go to questions.
Thanks very much. My name's Tom. I'm a Nuffield Scholar over from the UK. I'm just interested, how do you see the kind of Trump as, rowing back in the US on ESG? Is that going to have ramifications and slow down some of this kind of onward march of ESG and environmental reporting globally?
Thank you. And I think it's great. So the Nuffield Scholars are great. I actually spoke to the cohort in Canberra a couple of weeks ago. I know the last year ones. Whenever I'm in country, I do say to the scholars, if you're there, I've come to a meeting with me or be part of a panel, because I think it's important, particularly for the younger generation, that we do everything we can to encourage them. Look, I think that's why I went through this global uncertainty, but what does it mean? And I said, this is going to be happening anyway. Despite what Trump is saying, and I think a critical concern is how other countries are reacting to what he's saying, and what he's doing is that he's not going to be able to turn back the clock, okay? So we're already seeing the cost to the environment and the cost to GDP that not actually undertaking steps to improve what you're doing environmentally is having. The UK government, and look, I can't remember the cost, but I think there might have been a 17% fall in GDP if they weren't actually going to be thinking about repurposing their subsidies for environmental outcomes. In the end, and we know this in Australia better than most because we haven't been subsidised for a long time, is it actually costs us to not put in better practices. The real challenge is the science and the knowledge and the tools, and particularly now the technology is changing so quickly, it's actually hard to keep up. And so I think where government can actually enable is to put in the guardrails and the standards around what is a credible tool or what meets the right sort of requirements, but also then think, before they put in regulation, is how they actually can provide the incentives so they can bring people along. And New Zealand did it the other way. They actually had a program called He Waka Eka Noa that was really about knowing your number on farm for your carbon. And the threat was, if you don't do this, we're going to impose a methane tax. Now, they then had a change of government. He Waka Eka Noa's gone. Farmers were in a lot of uncertainty, but they're now saying, actually, what we've been doing gives us that information to make better decisions on farm. And the new government is also saying, well, we're not going to impose a methane tax, but we need to be working with you. I took that as really good lessons for what we need to do here. And I'm very much a strong proponent of use the carrot and use other levers available to you in terms of government policy to provide the incentives, and only come in with a stick when you have the active non-compliers. But compliance burden really does worry me in this whole, what's been almost a race towards this. So I don't think it's actually too bad a thing for us to slow down a bit. and say, let's look at what really works. And that's where making sure we can work with farmers, because that's where we're going to get what works in practice fed through, so it actually then underpins any framework and any policies, I think is really critically important.
Hello. Test, test. Hello, I'm Madeline Fisher, the current chair of Wheatbelt NRM. I have two questions, Sue, just building off the back of that one. I love to think about what's practical and do some scenario planning, and if we do have a bit of a US recession ahead of us and also a slowing down of trade with China, then what domestic policy shifts can we advocate for now that help to future-proof agriculture through this next 10 years? That's the first question. And the second one then is about inner development for the Sustainable Development Goals. What do you think is a core mindset that we can adopt now to help us with that?
Thank you. So the first question, I think one of the things that will be key is diversification. And that diversification goes from on-farm right the way through to government policies. At the government level, diversifying markets are really important. Now, for a long time, we've looked to the EU and the US as being the markets that we actually want to try and enter. In actual fact, Southeast Asia is our growing, close, and most lucrative market that we really should be looking to, and we are so well positioned here in Australia because we don't have a lot of competitors being able to supply into those markets the way that we can. So a lot of work is being done around Southeast Asian markets. I was in a number of Southeast Asian countries last year. I'll be going to Indonesia in another 4 weeks' time whenever I come back from South America, and then Philippines and Malaysia. Partly around that soft diplomacy, but also around then how do we actually help embed the development of free trade agreements so that we can actually get better trade and market access. On farm, it is also about thinking, how do you diversify? And how do you actually think about, if something like this is going to happen, what would I do? For me, I tend to say, have a look at this through a risk profile. Farmers understand risk. We deal with it every day. And so strip out, all of the noise we hear from different policies from around the world and just look at it through a risk lens and say, what are the risks that could be coming? What do I need to put in place to mitigate them? And where am I prepared to take the risk? The second question around the SDGs. Look, zero hunger is a key one, and it is something that is probably the focus of all of our multilateral organisations, particularly the FAO. However, there are quite a number of other SDGs. One of the things I'm going to start to do actually is, and I did it today, but I'm going to do it more and more, is actually align our sustainability framework with the SDGs, because I think that's important, because it actually, and particularly globally when I talk, that we actually have that connection with the SDGs. Do the SDGs mean a lot to us? Well, I think particularly in terms of the role that Australia plays globally, and this has been a really, I think, upsetting thing come from the US, is the pulling back on US aid. Australia actually has an organisation called the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research that invests in developing countries through partnerships, capacity building, particularly around women and young people, and is focused very much on nutrition and hunger, but also has been moving into sustainability. I hope those programs will continue in the short term. Australia will probably have to fill the gap in terms of the funding that's pulled out by the US. We're very much focused on Indo-Pacific, and of course it's very important for us to continue to do that, but there'll be a lot of money stripped out of the system that underpins what we need to do around the SDGs.
My name is Anne Jones. I work for the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development here in WA. Thank you for that talk. That was fantastic. My question was about kind of on ESGs as well. You did talk, you commented on food security and kind of linked that to nutrition. My question is around, given certain papers, I'm sorry, I can't think of any references off the top of my head, about the reduced quality of food that our agricultural systems are making compared to those nutritional profiles would have looked like 50 years ago or more. And given the report from the UN on performance measures in 2023 that says Australia has far and away the more obese children under the age of 5 than any other area in the world, what does that mean for agriculture, our systems, and does it mean anything for our systems currently, do you think, and what do we need to do about that?
A complex question, so I'll try and be brief. So nutrition is critically important, which is why I like to talk about nutrition. You can't just feed people more rice. They've actually got to have good nutrition. And that's a real challenge in developing countries. We actually have a nutrition problem in the developing in terms of access to food, and we have the opposite in developed countries. And look, I was even talking to, I think it was Malaysia, a Malaysian delegation, and they said they have the same with childhood obesity, primarily driven by fast food. So we have a nutrition problem in the developed countries by not eating the right thing. Farmers play a critical role. Agriculture plays an absolute critical role there. One of the things I bemoan is the fact, and we heard that in our Welcome to Country, about kids thinking their food comes from the supermarket. We've got a real disconnect between healthy, safe, nutritious food and farmers and agriculture, and we actually need to do more work to try and bridge that gap. And, you know, we do tell our stories, but I say this every time I speak to a group of people. Every time I talk to people, I'm talking to people who are here because you're interested in agriculture or farming or you're part of that community. We need to get to talk to the people who don't even know about farms, have lost that connection, and be able to get them to understand why it's so important. A sidebar, and I am very conscious of time, to that is science. The research in science is doing the most amazing things to be able to build nutrition into what we're doing. Unfortunately, and I'm talking about GMOs, gene editing, things like that, unfortunately, some of the ideology that comes from parts is saying you can't do that because it's bad. So we've really got to make sure that we're talking about safe, healthy, clean, green nutrition. And once again, our reputation for that is very good in Southeast Asia. We get a bit of pushback from the EU. Goodness knows what's going to happen with the US. Canada, we have a very good reputation with as well, and the Latins. So I think we need to work with like-minded organisations around the world to try and get that message through.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very good, and I like that you connect accountability and sustainable, how to kind of profit that, and your background in accounting is very interesting. So Luca De Prato from Murdoch University. I'm a research on crop nutrition and sustainable farming. So what I want to, because I work modeling how to transfer this benefit for farmers so they can uptake this option. So how you can best account the monetary benefit of soil health and transfer for farmers, especially consultants, when the price of certain crops, they go to the roof and they don't take into account the nutrition and benefit that the soil can bring to them in the long run. And how can we transfer that and show that actually there is a benefit and not just go for the quick buck and the long-term solution? Thanks.
The best way you can do that is to actually work with farmers and do pilots and trials and get them to actually see the benefits themselves. Because there's two things that does. And, you know, and I'm an example of that with my soil sampling. One, it actually shows them how they can actually make better decisions that make them more money. So they're always going to be happy about that. And then you have them part of that trial, so over the longer term, they provide an example to others. And farmers learn from other farmers, you know, we'll say they'll look over the fence. So you've then got farmers that are becoming your champions for that modelling. It's very hard to go out and say to farmers, on top of everything else we've got, this is a tool that's going to solve all your problems. And I get really concerned when I see some of the snake oil providers, you know, because how do you know as a farmer that this tool is actually going to be the one that's going to help you, or this is the one that's going to cost a lot of money and is not actually going to do the right thing? So for me, and we call it piloting, sandpitting, actually working with groups of farmers, working with the NRM groups, so you're actually able to test and trial and prove that what you're doing can actually work in practice, then allows you to actually scale that.